Flight Sergeant James Morrison adjusted his military dress uniform one final time as he approached the check-in counter at Heathrow Airport. The Victoria Cross medal gleamed proudly on his chest, catching the fluorescent lights of the busy terminal. He had earned this highest military honor during a dangerous rescue mission in Afghanistan, where he had saved 12 fellow soldiers from a burning helicopter under heavy enemy fire. James was traveling to Edinburgh for a special ceremony where he would meet other Victoria Cross recipients. The Queen's Guard Regiment had given him permission to wear his full dress uniform during travel, as was customary for such important military events. He carried his official travel documents and military authorization papers, everything properly signed and stamped. The British Airways check-in agent, Sarah Mitchell, barely looked up from her computer screen when James presented his ticket. She was having a particularly stressful day, dealing with flight delays and difficult passengers since early morning. Her supervisor had recently warned all staff about being more strict with passengers who might be trying to board with inappropriate clothing or fake credentials. "I'm sorry, sir, but you cannot board the aircraft wearing that costume," Sarah said dismissively, finally glancing at James's uniform. She had made a quick assumption that the elaborate military dress was some kind of theatrical outfit or fancy dress costume. The medals looked too shiny and new to be real in her opinion. James felt his face flush with embarrassment and confusion. "This isn't a costume, miss. I'm Flight Sergeant Morrison of the Queen's Guard. This is my official military dress uniform and I have authorization to wear it while traveling." Sarah rolled her eyes and shook her head firmly. "Sir, I've seen plenty of people try to board planes wearing military costumes for conventions or parties. Company policy strictly prohibits passengers from wearing fake military uniforms or impersonating service members. You'll need to change into civilian clothes or you won't be allowed on this flight." Other passengers in the long queue behind James began to murmur and crane their necks to see what was causing the delay. Some pulled out their phones to record what they thought might be an interesting confrontation. James felt the weight of their stares and whispered conversations as heat rose in his cheeks. "Please, let me show you my military identification and travel authorization," James said, reaching into his uniform jacket pocket. He pulled out his official ID card, military papers, and the documentation that specifically authorized him to travel in dress uniform for the ceremony in Edinburgh. Sarah barely glanced at the documents before pushing them back across the counter. "Anyone can fake these things nowadays, sir. I've been trained to spot fraudulent military documents and frankly, your medals look like something from a costume shop. Real military decorations don't shine like that." The irony was painful for James. His Victoria Cross was indeed new-looking because it had been recently awarded. The ceremony had taken place just 3 weeks earlier, and the medal had barely had time to develop the patina that older decorations acquired over years of wear. "Miss, please call your supervisor or contact Military Liaison Services. They can verify my credentials in minutes," James pleaded, his voice remaining respectful despite his growing frustration. He was acutely aware that his entire regiment was watching how he handled this situation, even if only in his own mind. Sarah's colleague, Mark Stevens, noticed the commotion and walked over to assist. He too took one look at James's uniform and immediately sided with Sarah's assessment. "Those medals are definitely fake," he whispered to Sarah, loud enough for James to hear. "Real military decorations don't look that polished. He's probably some military enthusiast trying to get attention." The situation escalated when Sarah decided to make an example of James in front of the other passengers. She stood up and spoke loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Sir, British Airways takes impersonation of military personnel very seriously. You are in violation of company policy and potentially breaking laws regarding fraudulent representation of military service." James felt his heart pounding as dozens of passengers turned to stare at him. Some were recording with their phones, others were shaking their heads in disapproval, clearly believing he was indeed a fraud trying to gain some kind of special treatment or attention by wearing a fake uniform. Furthermore, Sarah continued her public humiliation. "You will be downgraded from your business class seat to economy class as a penalty for this attempted deception. If you refuse to change into appropriate civilian clothing, you will be banned from this flight entirely." The demotion felt like a slap in the face to James, who had been looking forward to the comfortable flight as a small luxury before the important ceremony. More importantly, The public shame of being accused of stolen valor in front of so many people was devastating for a man who had risked his life for his country. James looked around at the faces surrounding him, seeing suspicion and judgment in their eyes. Some passengers were nodding in approval of the airline staff's firm stance, believing they were witnessing the rightful punishment of someone disrespecting military service by wearing fake decorations. "I understand you're doing your job," James said quietly, his voice barely containing his emotion. "But I assure you, I am a genuine member of Her Majesty's forces, and this Victoria Cross was earned through service to our country. Please just make one phone call to verify my identity." Sarah was unmoved by his plea and had already made up her mind. She printed out a new boarding pass for an economy seat and slid it across the counter with obvious disdain. "Take it or leave it, sir. Those are your options." James Morrison reluctantly accepted the economy boarding pass, his hands trembling slightly with suppressed anger and humiliation. The public spectacle had drawn even more attention, with several passengers now openly filming the encounter on their smartphones. He could already imagine the videos appearing on social media with titles about fake soldiers being exposed at airports. As he moved toward the security checkpoint, James overheard passengers discussing the incident behind him. "Did you see those shiny medals?" one woman whispered to her companion. "Clearly fake. Real war heroes don't need to show off like that." Another passenger nodded in agreement, adding, "Good for the airline staff for catching him. People like that give real veterans a bad name." The words cut deep into James's heart. He had never sought attention for his military service, and the Victoria Cross ceremony had been one of the most humble and emotional experiences of his life. To have his genuine sacrifice and heroism questioned so publicly felt like a betrayal of everything he had fought for. At security, James faced additional scrutiny. The security officer, having heard about the incident at check-in, examined his uniform with extra suspicion. "Remove all the medals and decorations," the officer instructed. "They need to go through the X-ray machine separately." James carefully unpinned his Victoria Cross and other service medals, placing them gently in the plastic tray. Watching his hard-earned honors disappear into the X-ray machine felt symbolic of how this journey was stripping away his dignity piece by piece. "Interesting collection," the security officer commented sarcastically as the medals emerged from the machine. "Where did you buy these? They look pretty authentic for costume pieces." James bit his tongue, forcing himself to remain silent rather than engage in another futile argument about the authenticity of his service. He had learned from his experience at check-in that trying to defend himself only seemed to make people more suspicious and convinced of his supposed deception. Once through security, James found a quiet corner of the departure lounge to collect himself. He called his commanding officer to report the incident, knowing that the regiment would want to be aware of any situations involving their personnel being publicly questioned or humiliated. "Morrison, this is unacceptable," Colonel Richards said firmly over the phone. "I'll be filing a formal complaint with British Airways immediately. Their staff clearly need better training on recognizing genuine military personnel and documentation." "Sir, I just want to get to Edinburgh for the ceremony," James replied wearily. "I don't want to miss the event because of this situation." "You won't miss it, Morrison. But this airline needs to understand the seriousness of what their staff have done today. They've publicly humiliated a Victoria Cross recipient based on ignorance and poor judgment." After ending the call, James noticed other passengers in the lounge stealing glances at him and whispering among themselves. Word of the fake soldier incident had spread through the departure area, and he was now a minor celebrity for all the wrong reasons. A young boy, perhaps 8 years old, approached James with wide eyes. "Mister, are you really a soldier?" he asked innocently. James knelt down to the child's level, managing a gentle smile despite his emotional turmoil. "Yes, I am. I serve in the Queen's Guard. My daddy says soldiers are heroes," the boy continued. "Did you really fight bad guys?" Before James could respond, the boy's mother rushed over and pulled her son away. "Don't bother the man, Tommy," she said, clearly having heard about the check-in incident. She gave James a disapproving look that made her opinion of him crystal clear. The boarding announcement finally came, and James joined the economy queue despite having originally purchased a business-class ticket. The flight attendants, who had been briefed about the military impersonator passenger, watched him carefully as he found his cramped middle seat between two other passengers. During the flight, James stared out the small window, thinking about the irony of his situation. Here he was, traveling to receive recognition alongside other genuine heroes, but he had been branded as a fraud by people who couldn't recognize real military service when they saw it. His seatmate, an elderly gentleman, struck up a conversation. "Terrible business about that fake soldier at check-in," the man said. "I was in the army myself back in the day. Real veterans would never parade around in dress uniform at an airport like that." James simply nodded and closed his eyes, pretending to sleep rather than engage in another painful conversation about his own supposed deception. The flight seemed to drag on forever, each minute a reminder of the humiliation he had endured. As the plane descended toward Edinburgh, James wondered if news of the incident had somehow reached the ceremony organizers. Would they question his credentials too? Would this embarrassing episode overshadow what should have been one of the proudest moments of his military career? The landing announcement brought James back to the present moment. In just a few hours, he would be standing alongside other Victoria Cross recipients in a ceremony honoring their service and sacrifice. He tried to focus on that positive thought, pushing aside the memory of suspicious stares and whispered accusations that had filled his morning. Little did James know that news of his treatment was already spreading far beyond the confines of the aircraft, and that powerful people were taking notice of how a genuine war hero had been treated by the airline. Meanwhile, back at Heathrow Airport, Sarah Mitchell and Mark Stevens were feeling quite pleased with themselves. They believed they had successfully prevented a military impersonator from taking advantage of airline services and possibly deceiving other passengers. Sarah had even received a supportive message from her supervisor commending her for being vigilant about potential fraud. "I can't believe he thought those shiny fake medals would fool us," Sarah said to Mark during their coffee break. "The Victoria Cross, really? As if someone with such an important medal would just be flying commercial to Edinburgh." Mark laughed and shook his head. "These military wannabes are getting bolder every year. Thank goodness we stopped him before he could cause more trouble or upset any real veterans on the flight." Neither of them realized that several passengers had posted videos of the incident on social media platforms. The footage showed James Morrison being publicly accused of wearing fake military decorations and being demoted from business class to economy. The videos were beginning to circulate rapidly, with many viewers expressing outrage at how the soldier had been treated. Dr. Amanda Foster, a military historian who happened to be at Heathrow for a different flight, had witnessed the entire incident. She immediately recognized the authenticity of James's uniform and decorations, having spent years studying military honors and insignia. Furious at what she had observed, she posted a detailed thread on social media explaining exactly why the soldier's uniform and medals were genuine. "I just witnessed a disgraceful incident at Heathrow," Dr. Foster wrote. "A genuine Victoria Cross recipient was publicly humiliated by British Airways staff who accused him of wearing fake military decorations. This man's uniform, medals, and bearing were absolutely authentic. The airline owes him a massive apology." Her post began gaining traction immediately, being shared by military support groups, veteran organizations, and concerned citizens. Military experts and historians began commenting, confirming Dr. Foster's assessment and expressing shock at how poorly the soldier had been treated. Colonel Richards had wasted no time in escalating the complaint to the highest levels of British Airways management. He contacted the airline's military liaison department, the customer service director, and even reached out to members of parliament who served on defense committees. "This is more than just poor customer service," Colonel Richards explained to British Airways executives during an emergency conference call. "This is a direct insult to our armed forces and to a man who risked his life saving others." Flight Sergeant Morrison earned his Victoria Cross through extraordinary courage under fire. The airline executives were beginning to realize the magnitude of their staff's error. The Victoria Cross is the highest military decoration awarded for valor in the face of the enemy, and only a handful are awarded each year. The idea that their staff had dismissed such an honor as a fake costume was becoming a public relations nightmare. British media outlets had picked up the story from social media, with journalists contacting the airline for comment. Military correspondent Tom Bradley from the BBC was preparing a segment about the incident. Having obtained footage from passengers and statements from military officials confirming James's credentials. British Airways staff mistake genuine war hero for impersonator, read the headline being prepared for the evening news. The story was set to air during prime time, potentially reaching millions of viewers who would learn how poorly the airline had treated a decorated soldier. Back in Edinburgh, James had arrived at his hotel, still feeling the sting of the morning's humiliation. He was unaware that his story was spreading across the internet and that military officials, politicians, and thousands of ordinary citizens were expressing outrage on his behalf. The ceremony organizers had heard whispers about an incident involving one of their honorees, but the details were still unclear. Major General Patricia Hawthorne, who was coordinating the event, made a note to check on Flight Sergeant Morrison's well-being when he arrived for the evening's reception. Meanwhile, the palace had been informed about the incident through military channels. King Charles III's private secretary had briefed him on the situation, explaining that a Victoria Cross recipient had been publicly humiliated by airline staff who refused to believe his military credentials were genuine. "This is absolutely unacceptable," the king had said quietly, his voice containing a rare note of anger. "Flight Sergeant Morrison represents the very best of our armed forces. To have him treated in this manner is an insult to every person who has served our country with distinction." The palace began making discreet inquiries about James's travel schedule and location. Royal protection officers were already aware that the king had a brief layover scheduled at Edinburgh Airport the following morning while traveling to a separate engagement in Scotland. British Airways management was now in full crisis mode. Their customer service team was being flooded with angry messages from the public. Their social media accounts were overwhelmed with negative comments, and military organizations were threatening to boycott the airline unless immediate action was taken. "We need to find this passenger and make this right," declared the airline CEO during an emergency board meeting. "Every minute we wait makes this situation worse. The public relations damage is already enormous." The company's head of military affairs was dispatched to Edinburgh with instructions to locate James Morrison and personally deliver an apology along with a substantial compensation package. However, they were unaware that much more significant forces were now moving behind the scenes. News producers were preparing their evening broadcasts. Social media influencers were sharing the story with their followers, and military veterans across the country were expressing solidarity with their mistreated comrade. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would far exceed anything British Airways management could have anticipated. Meanwhile, back at Heathrow Airport, Sarah Mitchell and Mark Stevens were feeling quite pleased with themselves. They believed they had successfully prevented a military impersonator from taking advantage of airline services and possibly deceiving other passengers. Sarah had even received a supportive message from her supervisor, commending her for being vigilant about potential fraud. "I can't believe he thought those shiny fake medals would fool us," Sarah said to Mark during their coffee break. "The Victoria Cross, really? As if someone with such an important medal would just be flying commercial to Edinburgh." Mark laughed and shook his head. "These military wannabes are getting bolder every year. Thank goodness we stopped him before he could cause more trouble or upset any real veterans on the flight." Neither of them realized that several passengers had posted videos of the incident on social media platforms. The footage showed James Morrison being publicly accused of wearing fake military decorations and being demoted from business class to economy. The videos were beginning to circulate rapidly, with many viewers expressing outrage at how the soldier had been treated. Dr. Amanda Foster, a military historian who happened to be at Heathrow for a different flight, had witnessed the entire incident. She immediately recognized the authenticity of James's uniform and decorations, having spent years studying military honors and insignia. Furious at what she had observed, she posted a detailed thread on social media explaining exactly why the soldier's uniform and medals were genuine. "I just witnessed a disgraceful incident at Heathrow," Dr. Foster wrote. "A genuine Victoria Cross recipient was publicly humiliated by British Airways staff who accused him of wearing fake military decorations. This man's uniform, medals, and bearing were absolutely authentic. The airline owes him a massive apology." Her post began gaining traction immediately, being shared by military support groups, veteran organizations, and concerned citizens. Military experts and historians began commenting, confirming Dr. Foster's assessment and expressing shock at how poorly the soldier had been treated. Colonel Richards had wasted no time in escalating the complaint to the highest levels of British Airways management. He contacted the airline's military liaison department, the customer service director, and even reached out to members of parliament who served on defense committees. This is more than just poor customer service, Colonel Richards explained to British Airways executives during an emergency conference call. This is a direct insult to our armed forces and to a man who risked his life saving others. Flight Sergeant Morrison earned his Victoria Cross through extraordinary courage under fire. The airline executives were beginning to realize the magnitude of their staff's error. The Victoria Cross is the highest military decoration awarded for valor in the face of the enemy, and only a handful are awarded each year. The idea that their staff had dismissed such an honor as a fake costume was becoming a public relations nightmare. British media outlets had picked up the story from social media, with journalists contacting the airline for comment. Military correspondent Tom Bradley from the BBC was preparing a segment about the incident, having obtained footage from passengers and statements from military officials confirming James's credentials. British Airways staff mistake genuine war hero for impersonator, read the headline being prepared for the evening news. The story was set to air during prime time, potentially reaching millions of viewers who would learn how poorly the airline had treated a decorated soldier. Back in Edinburgh, James had arrived at his hotel, still feeling the sting of the morning's humiliation. He was unaware that his story was spreading across the internet, and that military officials, politicians, and thousands of ordinary citizens were expressing outrage on his behalf. The ceremony organizers had heard whispers about an incident involving one of their honorees, but the details were still unclear. Major General Patricia Hawthorne, who was coordinating the event, made a note to check on Flight Sergeant Morrison's well-being when he arrived for the evening's reception. Meanwhile, the palace had been informed about the incident through military channels. King Charles III's private secretary had briefed him on the situation, explaining that a Victoria Cross recipient had been publicly humiliated by airline staff who refused to believe his military credentials were genuine. "This is absolutely unacceptable," the king had said quietly, his voice containing a rare note of anger. "Flight Sergeant Morrison represents the very best of our armed forces. To have him treated in this manner is an insult to every person who has served our country with distinction." The palace began making discreet inquiries about James's travel schedule and location. Royal protection officers were already aware that the king had a brief layover scheduled at Edinburgh Airport the following morning while traveling to a separate engagement in Scotland. British Airways management was now in full crisis mode. Their customer service team was being flooded with angry messages from the public. Their social media accounts were overwhelmed with negative comments, and military organizations were threatening to boycott the airline unless immediate action was taken. "We need to find this passenger and make this right," declared the airline's CEO during an emergency board meeting. "Every minute we wait makes this situation worse. The public relations damage is already enormous." The company's head of military affairs was dispatched to Edinburgh with instructions to locate James Morrison and personally deliver an apology along with a substantial compensation package. However, they were unaware that much more significant forces were now moving behind the scenes. News producers were preparing their evening broadcasts. Social media influencers were sharing the story with their followers, and military veterans across the country were expressing solidarity with their mistreated comrade. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would far exceed anything British Airways management could have anticipated. The next morning, James Morrison prepared to return to London, feeling emotionally drained from the previous day's humiliation, despite the support he had received from his fellow Victoria Cross recipients. The ceremony had been beautiful and meaningful, but the airport incident still weighed heavily on his mind. As he packed his uniform carefully in his travel bag, James reflected on the irony of his situation. He had faced Taliban fighters in Afghanistan without flinching, had run into burning buildings to save lives, and had earned the highest military honor his country could bestow. Yet a simple trip to the airport had left him feeling more defeated than any battlefield experience. His phone had been buzzing constantly with messages from journalists, military colleagues, and even strangers who had seen the news coverage. The story had grown far beyond what he had anticipated, and he was beginning to worry about the attention it was bringing to him and his regiment. At Edinburgh Airport, James approached the British Airways check-in counter with considerable apprehension. He was wearing civilian clothes this time, having decided to pack his uniform to avoid any repeat of the previous day's confrontation. The staff at this counter had been briefed about the incident and were expecting him. "Flight Sergeant Morrison?" asked the check-in agent Lucy Campbell with obvious nervousness in her voice. "I'm so sorry about what happened to you yesterday at Heathrow. We've been instructed to ensure you receive the very best service today." James appreciated the gesture, but the damage had already been done. The agent upgraded him back to business class and apologized repeatedly, clearly understanding the seriousness of the situation her colleagues had created. As James proceeded through security and toward his departure gate, he noticed increased activity around the airport. There seemed to be more security personnel than usual, and several official-looking vehicles were parked near the terminal. He assumed it was routine security exercises and thought nothing more of it. Unknown to James, King Charles III's aircraft was approaching Edinburgh Airport at that very moment. The king had adjusted his schedule specifically to ensure he would arrive while James was still at the airport, setting the stage for a carefully orchestrated encounter. Royal protection officers had been quietly coordinating with airport security all morning, ensuring that the king's unscheduled visit would proceed smoothly, while maintaining the element of surprise that would maximize its impact. At British Airways headquarters in London, executives were monitoring James's travel in real time, hoping to intercept him with senior management representatives who could deliver a personal apology. They had chartered a private jet to Edinburgh, carrying the airline's CEO and head of military relations, but they were running behind schedule. "We need to reach Morrison before he boards his flight back to London," the CEO instructed his team. "This situation is spiraling out of control, and we need to be seen taking decisive action." Social media was still buzzing with the story, and British Airways was taking a beating in the court of public opinion. Military support groups had organized a campaign, encouraging people to boycott the airline until they made appropriate amends to James. Morrison. The Palace communications team had been monitoring the situation closely, noting the public's overwhelming support for the mistreated soldier and anger toward the airline. They recognized this as an opportunity for the king to demonstrate his support for the military while addressing a genuine injustice. At Edinburgh Airport, James was sitting in the departure lounge, reading the morning newspapers that featured his story prominently. He was amazed at how much attention the incident had received and grateful for the support being expressed by military and civilian communities alike. "Flight Sergeant Morrison?" a voice said behind him. James turned to see a well-dressed man in his 50s approaching with an apologetic expression. "I'm David Richardson, head of military affairs for British Airways," the man said, extending his hand. "I've flown up from London specifically to apologize for yesterday's incident and to discuss how we can make this right." James shook the offered hand politely, but remained cautious. "I appreciate you coming, sir, but the damage has already been done. The whole country saw me being accused of stolen valor on social media." Richardson sat down beside James, clearly uncomfortable with the conversation he needed to have. "We understand the severity of what happened, and we're prepared to offer substantial compensation, along with our sincere apologies. Our staff made a terrible error in judgment." Before James could respond, there was a sudden increase in activity around the departure area. Airport security personnel were taking positions, and several passengers were looking toward the main entrance with curiosity and excitement. "Is there some kind of emergency?" James asked, noticing the heightened security presence. Richardson looked around nervously, also puzzled by the unusual activity. He had no idea that his carefully planned apology meeting was about to be interrupted by the arrival of the British monarch, who had very different ideas about how this situation should be resolved. The airport's public address system crackled to life with an announcement that would change everything. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are honored to welcome His Majesty King Charles III to Edinburgh Airport. Please remain in your current locations as His Majesty makes his way through the terminal." James felt his blood run cold. The king was here, at the same airport where he was sitting, just one day after his public humiliation by the airline. The timing could not be coincidental. and he began to suspect that his story had reached much higher levels than he had ever imagined. The atmosphere in Edinburgh Airport's departure lounge became electric as news of the King's arrival spread among passengers and staff. People were pulling out their phones to record the historic moment, while security personnel worked to maintain clear pathways for the royal entourage. James Morrison sat frozen in his seat, his mind racing as he tried to process what was happening. The British Airways executive beside him, David Richardson, had gone pale as he realized that this royal visit was likely connected to the incident they were discussing. "This can't be a coincidence," Richardson muttered under his breath, checking his phone frantically for any messages from his headquarters about the King's unexpected presence. Through the large windows overlooking the tarmac, passengers could see the royal aircraft that had just landed. A convoy of official vehicles was already in position, and red carpeting was being rolled out by airport staff who had clearly been prepared for this visit, despite its apparent spontaneity to the general. Public. King Charles III entered the terminal, surrounded by his protection officers and a small entourage of officials. He was dressed impeccably in a dark suit, carrying himself with the dignity and authority that befitted his position. However, those who knew him could detect an underlying tension in his demeanor that suggested this was not merely a ceremonial visit. Airport staff and passengers alike stood respectfully as the King made his way through the terminal, but it quickly became apparent that he was not simply passing through. He was walking directly toward the departure lounge where James Morrison was sitting. Flight Sergeant Morrison, called one of the King's private secretaries, approaching James with official protocols in mind. "His Majesty requests the honor of your presence for a brief conversation." James stood immediately, his military training taking over despite his shock at the situation. He was acutely aware that dozens of passengers were recording this encounter, and that whatever happened next would likely be seen by millions of people around the world. The King approached James with a warm but serious expression, extending his hand in greeting. "Flight Sergeant Morrison, I am deeply troubled by what I have learned about your treatment yesterday. Please accept my personal apologies for the disrespect you experienced." James was speechless for a moment, overwhelmed by the surreal nature of having the monarch personally address his airport humiliation. "Your Majesty, this is completely unexpected. I never imagined." "The Victoria Cross represents the highest ideals of courage and sacrifice in service to our nation," the King continued, his voice carrying clearly in the suddenly quiet departure lounge. "When someone questions the authenticity of that decoration, they question the valor of every person who has ever worn it." David Richardson, the British Airways executive, realized he was witnessing a public relations catastrophe for his company unfold in real time. The King was not just offering personal support to James Morrison. He was making a very public statement about the airline's treatment of a decorated war hero. King Charles turned slightly to address the gathering crowd of passengers and airport staff, many of whom were still recording with their phones. Flight Sergeant Morrison earned his Victoria Cross through extraordinary courage in Afghanistan, where he saved the lives of 12 fellow soldiers under enemy fire. Yesterday, he was publicly humiliated by airline staff who accused him of wearing fake military decorations. The crowd murmured in shock and disapproval, with many passengers looking toward Richardson with obvious disgust. Some had witnessed the original incident at Heathrow through social media, and they were now seeing the King himself addressing the injustice. "This treatment is not just unacceptable toward Flight Sergeant Morrison personally," the King continued, his voice growing stronger. "It represents a fundamental failure to recognize and respect the sacrifices made by all our service members. When we question the authenticity of military honors, we dishonor everyone who has served our country with distinction." James felt tears welling up in his eyes, not from sadness but from profound gratitude that his sovereign had taken such a personal interest in defending his honor. The humiliation of the previous day was being transformed into a moment of national recognition for military service. Richardson knew he had to act quickly to salvage his company's reputation. He stepped forward hesitantly, clearing his throat to gain attention. "Your Majesty, I am David Richardson from British Airways. We are here today to personally apologize to Flight Sergeant Morrison and to make full amends for our staff's inexcusable error." The King turned to face Richardson with an expression that could only be described as coldly polite. "Mr. Richardson, Your company's staff publicly accused a Victoria Cross recipient of fraud. They humiliated him in front of dozens of passengers and treated him as a criminal for wearing the uniform he earned through extraordinary courage. How exactly do you propose to make amends for such treatment? The question hung in the air like a challenge, with everyone present understanding that this was no longer just about customer service or corporate apologies. This had become a matter of national honor and respect for military service, with the monarch himself demanding accountability. Richardson was perspiring despite the cool morning air, realizing that anything he said would be recorded and shared widely. His company's response to this royal challenge would define British Airways' relationship with the military community for years to come. The passengers surrounding them had formed an impromptu gallery, witnessing what would undoubtedly become one of the most memorable confrontations between royal authority and corporate responsibility in recent British history. David Richardson stood before King Charles III, acutely aware that his response would be watched by millions and could determine the future of British Airways' relationship with the military community. The silence in the departure lounge was deafening as passengers held their breath, waiting to see how the corporate executive would respond to the monarch's pointed challenge. "Your Majesty," Richardson began, his voice slightly trembling, "British Airways accepts full responsibility for this inexcusable incident. We will be implementing immediate changes to our staff training programs to ensure that military personnel and their decorations are properly recognized and respected." The king's expression remained stern and unforgiving. "Training programs, Mr. Richardson? Your staff accused a man who risked his life for others of being a fraud. They humiliated him publicly and treated his highest military honor as a costume party trinket. This goes far beyond a training issue." James Morrison watched in amazement as the king continued to defend his honor with such passion and authority. He had never imagined that his personal humiliation would become a matter of royal intervention, and he was deeply moved by the sovereign's commitment to military dignity. Furthermore, the king continued, addressing both Richardson and the gathered crowd, "British Airways will be making a substantial donation to military charities as penance for this insult to our armed forces. Flight Sergeant Morrison will also receive lifetime complimentary travel privileges in recognition of both his service to the crown and the disgraceful treatment he received from your staff." Richardson nodded vigorously, knowing he had no choice but to agree to whatever the king demanded. "Of course, Your Majesty. We will make arrangements immediately for a donation of £1 million to military charities. And Flight Sergeant Morrison will receive our highest tier of lifetime travel benefits." The crowd began to murmur approvingly, with many passengers applauding the king's intervention and the airline's forced accountability. Social media was exploding as people shared videos of the unprecedented royal confrontation, with hashtags like King Defends Hero and Victoria Cross Vindicated trending worldwide. King Charles then turned back to James Morrison, his expression softening considerably. "Flight Sergeant, I want you to know that your service and sacrifice are deeply appreciated by the Crown and by our entire nation. The Victoria Cross you wear represents not just your own courage, but the finest traditions of British military service." James stood at attention and replied with heartfelt emotion, "Your Majesty, your support today means more to me than I can express. To have my sovereign defend my honor in this way is beyond anything I could have imagined." The king then made an announcement that stunned everyone present. "Flight Sergeant Morrison, I would be honored if you would accompany me to my next engagement in Glasgow. You should travel as befits a Victoria Cross recipient, not in the cramped conditions you were forced to endure yesterday." The offer was unprecedented, and James felt overwhelmed by the royal gesture. "Your Majesty, I would be deeply honored to accept your invitation." As royal staff began making arrangements for James to join the king's entourage, David Richardson realized that this incident would become a case study in crisis management and corporate responsibility. His company had not only been publicly humiliated but had been forced to make expensive concessions under the most public circumstances possible. The king's private secretary approached Richardson with a formal document. "Mr. Richardson, His Majesty expects written confirmation of British Airways commitments within 24 hours, including the charitable donation and Flight Sergeant Morrison's lifetime travel privileges." Richardson accepted the document with shaking hands, knowing that his board of directors would be furious about the financial commitments he had just made, but understanding that refusing the king's demands was not an option. As news crews began arriving at the airport, having been alerted by the viral social media coverage, the story was evolving from a customer service complaint into a national news event. The king's intervention had transformed James Morrison from a humiliated passenger into a symbol of military honor and royal support for veterans. British Airways stock prices were plummeting in real-time trading as investors reacted to the public relations disaster and the unexpected financial commitments. The company's crisis management team was working frantically to contain the damage, but the visual of the king personally defending a mistreated veteran was impossible to spin positively for the airline. Meanwhile, back at Heathrow Airport, Sarah Mitchell and Mark Stevens were watching the news coverage in horror. Their supervisor had already informed them that they were suspended pending a full investigation, and they were beginning to understand the magnitude of their error in judgment. As James Morrison prepared to board the royal aircraft alongside King Charles III, he reflected on the extraordinary turn his life had taken in just 24 hours. From public humiliation to royal vindication, his experience had become a powerful reminder of the importance of respecting military service and the decorations that represent genuine heroism. The king's final words to the gathered crowd summarized the lesson of the entire incident. When we fail to recognize and honor the sacrifices made by our service members, we diminish ourselves as a nation. Today we have corrected that failure, and Flight Sergeant Morrison's honor has been fully restored. As the royal aircraft taxied away from Edinburgh Airport, carrying both the king and the vindicated Victoria Cross recipient, passengers throughout the terminal continued to share videos and photos of what they had witnessed. The story would be retold for years as an example of how royal intervention could still matter in modern Britain, and how the authentic service and sacrifice of military heroes should never be questioned or dismissed by those who have never faced such trials themselves.